A lot of the conversations I'm having at the moment revolve around people imagining with me, what now? And I find myself reacting to the words we're using. It's things like, returning to, going back to. And I find myself wondering, going back to what? Returning to where? And it has this sense of, we've been through a year of collective trauma, and it's created this deep sense of urgency that we really need to think about, what is it that we're returning to? What is it that we're going back to? This collective trauma that we've all been through has created this surge in change makers. And I have to say that it really has had that impact on me. I've got a really deep sense of urgency that we need to shift, that we need to change. And that we really need to turn over the stones and look underneath and reveal what's hidden and really ask those questions that we haven't been asking. And I recently read a quote by Jim Collins, and it goes, "There'll be no new normal. There'll only be a continuous series of not normal episodes that defy prediction and are unforeseen by most of us until they happen." And that either deeply excites you or deeply frightens you, one or the other. But whichever it does, we definitely need to consider, how do we adapt to that? How do we adapt to that level of change? And it's not like we've gone through a traumatic event and we're going to hit this wonderful sort of leveling off for another 10, 20, 30 years where we can just relax. In reality, we have to deal with continuous change. And how do we need to adapt to that? And how do we ride the waves of uncertainty? How does the world need to change? And it's so often the case when you start thinking about changing the world, you realize that the only place you can start and the only place that you can work on is the shift inside yourself. I was thinking back to when I first started my career, or sort of when I just was shiny and bright from having completed my engineering degree and having chartered as an engineer, and then shifting across into what was quite a new field at that time of management consultancy. And at that point, I thought it was all about being a knower, that you had to be the expert. And I certainly wasn't. I'd land on these projects and I would barely understand what we were there to do, let alone have any pre-made solution in my bag of tricks. And so I would be like that proverbial duck. I'd be madly paddling underneath the water while serenely and intelligently nodding, hoping at some point I'd figure out what I was there to do. And in this sort of furtive quest for knowledge, I find myself talking to everybody, one conversation leading to the next throughout this organization. And almost inevitably, I would find somebody deep in the project network who held an inordinate amount of influence without even realizing it. And one of those people was a guy called Richard, and he worked in the basement of Holborn Building, which was working with London Underground at the time. And he had the job of handing out the ticket that let you get onto the railway at night. And this was a remarkably powerful job, because the only way that you did this massive change that they were trying to do, they're trying to upgrade the whole of the Underground. And all of that work had to fit into these tiny little windows in the evenings and on weekends when the trains weren't running. And he had the power. He'd hand over the ticket that said, you can go on the evenings. But there was a problem. There's an entire part of the business which spent huge amounts of time thinking strategically about how you planned the work to make sure that it was the most productive that it possibly could be. The only problem is that Richard wasn't tied into that. Richard decided who went onto the railway based on his admittedly extensive experience of the railway and who filled in the forms correctly. And so there's just this disconnect within the company. And it became really obvious that my only job was to connect Richard back into the system. I didn't need to be the knower. I didn't need to be the expert. I actually needed to be a connector and connect the Richards of this world back into the wider system. It made him a significantly less stressed man and got the whole system running again in a much more productive way. And it makes you realize how oblivious we often are to all of these underlying networks that are happening within our organizations, the shadow organizations that tie things together. And I recently have been reading The Entangled Life. And in The Entangled Life, it explores this whole new understanding that's coming through on the role of fungi within our ecosystems. And the fact that there is this thing called mycelium, which connect our trees together and allow the trees almost to speak to each other, to share nutrients, to support each other. And whilst my knowledge of biology is deeply sketchy, it is remarkably familiar sounding when you apply it to our human systems. And it makes me wonder, should we be exploring in our organizations, within our human systems, our own mycelial network? And should we be looking at how we rewild our organizations, so that we can create these wonderfully diverse and resilient environments where humans can flourish and adapt to the constant change that we're about to go through, or that we are already going through at the moment. And I guess all of this talk of fungi, mycelial networks, rewilding our organizations, it's deeply uncomfortable language. It just doesn't fit with how we tend to talk about our work. But I suppose when you think about that, the language of our organizations, it comes from its military past. And it comes from the shift that was created when the industrial era happened. And it matches the mechanistic understanding of working in a factory, where there's a certain amount of certainty, etc. And I wonder that as we're trying to work more in harmony with nature, and is the language we currently have adequate? And if we need to make this sort of fundamental shift in how we think and how we work and how we build, do we have the language to even create that sort of thoughts in our head and to make that change? We are the children of and the grandchildren of the Industrial Revolution. And we've attempted to rise above nature and to create certainty where there really is none. Nature is human nature, and the natural world around us is naturally completely interconnected. And it is messy and it's chaotic. We need to accept that we're not separate from nature. We are part of nature. And we need to take our place within nature. Is it possibly time for us to therefore look to nature to learn and to reclaim words that might otherwise feel deeply uncomfortable to use? Words such as connecting, of mycelium. We need to be talking about rewilding our organizations. And thinking back to that moment where, I had this certainty that I had to be the knower and the expert, and I had to go through the deep discomfort of realizing I was this connector and, having to stand there and say, well, I don't know. And that was incredibly vulnerable and a really hard change to make, and one that I still sometimes struggle with. I can still find myself going back to the comfort zone of being the knower and being the expert, when actually I work at my best and I do my most powerful work when I step forward into that connecting role. And I wonder whether at this late stage in my career, I'm going through another one of these shifts. Maybe we just need to be uncomfortable utilizing a language that others may not understand at this point, that I may not even know what the words are. But, maybe we need to just lean into that discomfort, because if we're going to change how we think and work and build, we need the mycelium. The mycelial network is going to be fundamental to making this change. We have to do this together. And if we don't rewild our organizations, if we keep trying to create these perfect English gardens, with their neat rows of trees, we'll never get the biodiversity. We'll never get the power of the organizations we need, the way we need to connect together to create the change we want to see in this world.